A very important commemoration was marked yesterday. The 2nd of September 2024 marks the 79th anniversary of the absolute end of the war in the Pacific. This is World War II we're talking about. Sue Belinda Meehan, what I'm curious about is why absolute end of the war in the Pacific, Sue Belinda?
Good morning. It
Morning.
took a long time, Steve. The first part of the long goodbye was the 15th of August. Now, the 15th of August 1945 was an incredible day for the Japanese, an absolutely incredible day, because it was the day on which they heard their emperor's voice.
Let me play a bit of it.
深く世界の体制と帝国の現状とに鑑み以上の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲しここに終了なる汝市民に次ぐ秦は帝国政府をして米英四祖四国に対しその共同宣言を受諾する旨通告せしめたりそもそも帝国市民の
The voice of the then Japanese Emperor Hirohito, and up until that point, his people had never heard his voice.
Never heard his voice, and most would die never hearing it again. It was called a dual voice broadcast. His voice was a jewel. Remember that he was regarded as a deity.
He was regarded as a god.
As a god.
The Japanese people regarded him as a god.
Absolutely.
So when they went to war, they were following the instructions of a god.
Of a god. And at no point in his speech does he say anything about on behalf of the people of Japan, because he was regarded as the embodiment of the people of Japan.
Emperor Hirohito was Japan.
He was Japan. And at no point in his broadcast does he say, "We surrender."
You're kidding, really?
Really?
I never knew that.
No.
I went to school, I studied history.
Yes.
I did a fair bit at university as well. He never actually said, "We surrender."
No, never. He said, "We accept the requirements of the Potsdam Conference." And we lay down our arms, which, of course, not everybody believed. There were people who were fighting until 2005.
So most of my listeners would say, you know, the 15th of August 1945 as the end of World War II.
And a lot of people commemorate that as VJ Day. One of the things that I really admire about Australia was that Australia chose not ever to refer to it as a VJ Day because it wasn't about victory over anyone. They referred to it as VP Day, which is victory in the Pacific, meaning peace for the Pacific, so that war was at an end and everyone could return to peace.
The Potsdam Conference said, and I quote, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction," end of quote. So the Emperor of Japan was Emperor Hirohito.
Yes.
He gave the dual voice broadcast, as you've said.
Yep.
In the speech, he announced to who he had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, to us or to the Japanese people?
To the Japanese people.
Okay.
So it was a broadcast, a very widespread broadcast to the Japanese people who stopped, stood and bowed. Now, when his voice came into their homes or into their workplaces, they stopped, they stood and they bowed to recognise the honour that was being bestowed upon them to hear the voice of the Emperor, which is quite extraordinary. I mean...
It's hard for us to get a head around that now, isn't it?
Well, I mean, my dad was a card-carrying Australian. He became an Australian 12 months after he arrived here, which was as fast as he could do it. But before that, he was a Welshman. So when the Queen gave her Christmas message, we all stood and listened because that was how you demonstrated your respect. And the Japanese people certainly demonstrated their respect for the Emperor. The voice quite captured my attention because it's frail. This is not a man used to being required to say things. This is not a man whose communications were public. This is not a man who was required to say such words as, "We accept the demands of another group of countries upon our country." It was an extraordinary time, and over the course of the 15th of August through to the 2nd of September, America set about doing things to make it all the more difficult. There were quite extraordinary things. Do you want to talk about the speech for a little bit?
Well, can I ask you a bit? I just wanted to know, so the speech was given on the 15th of August.
Indeed.
But for many Japanese, the war continued in places like the Guadalcanal, which is not that far from us.
Oh, no, I know.
Just up a bit from PNG.
Just up the road a bit.
Just up the road a bit.
Yep.
So just tell me the story of those.
Okay.
Because there's one famous story, I think it was in the 70s. They managed to find a Japanese soldier who was in the jungle, maybe in the Philippines, was still fighting. So Japanese...
They found one in 2005, Steve.
What?
Yeah. Poor old gentleman, still soldiering on and still doing whatever he could for the glory of the Emperor of Japan.
In 2005?
2005.
Whereabouts?
Can
you recall?
I've actually written it down for you, so we'll start it at the beginning and go through. So smaller groups kept fighting in Guadalcanal, Peleliui, and various parts of the Philippines right up to 1948.
I have no idea where Peleliui is.
Peleliui is not far from the corridor between Guadalcanal Canal.
Yeah, Guadalcanal.
Canal.
Yep.
And the Philippines.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So one extraordinary story belongs to Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, who continued fighting at Lubang in the Philippines through until the 9th of March 1974, 29 years after the end of the war. Isn't that extraordinary?
Did the Philippines army or soldiers know that they were fighting?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean...
A Japanese soldier who was buried in the jungle there?
He was buried in the jungle and he would come out and fight his little guerrilla war. He doggedly refused to lay down his arms. He received formal orders. Japan flew a senior officer in to the Philippines to require him to lay down his arms.
Otherwise he wouldn't accept it?
He would not accept it.
Because he didn't hear the Emperor Hirohito's words, obviously.
He didn't.
He didn't hear them.
No.
Does that happen often in war? But just forgive me my random question, but, war at that time, communication wasn't as instantaneous as it is now. How would any soldier know that war had come to an end if they hadn't sort of got some sort of direct order?
Well, this is true. There are stories in World War II of German soldiers up in the far north, up towards the Arctic Circle, who hadn't received any notification that the war was at an end.
Wouldn't be the first time a commanding officer forgot about their troops in far-flung places.
No. No, well, they were just about starving when they were literally rescued by those who had been their enemies, because they were thinking, how are we expected to defend this little piece of ice if they don't send us armaments and food? We'll die.
All right.
So he was the sole survivor of a small band. One of them surrendered in 1950 after becoming separated. He told them that there were others in the jungle, but they couldn't find them. The second chap in this group of three with Onoda, he died in a gun battle with local forces in 1954. So, and then we come to May 2005, 19 years ago, Steve. 60 years after the end of the war, 2 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. One was Yoshiro Yamakawa, who was 87, and the other was Suzuki Nakachi, who was 85. And they'd become separated, but they had believed that their job was never to surrender. That was part of their training. You never surrender.
This is, in a sense, gives credence to the American decision to drop the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, because their intelligence was saying, unless we utterly overwhelm them, they will never surrender.
Sadly true, yes.
All right, so let's move on. I don't want to drag things out. So
No.
That's so Australia, Victory in the Pacific Day, VJ Day is how they call it in the UK,
Yep.
but we don't because
No.
we say it's victory. We're not having victory over someone.
No, we're having the return
It's
of peace.
return of peace, which I kind of like.
I like it too.
So keep going. Give me some of the more of these oddities. So the Australian government gazetted the 15th as a public holiday in
It did indeed.
5045. Yep.
Yep. And a huge party was held. But when September the 2nd, 1945 rolled around, it was intended that Hirohito would board the Iowa-class battleship USS Missouri. Now, Steve, why would they send the USS Missouri? It's only a battleship. It's not an aircraft carrier.
I don't know. Why did they send the USS Missouri? Simply, I feel like there's going to be a light bulb moment here.
It is a light bulb moment because the Missouri was chosen because it was the president's home state.
Right.
So it
The
was
US president, okay.
US president. So it was ramming home something, and it served
A
as
diplomatic exclamation mark.
Oh, there were a lot of them, Steve. A lot of them.
Run me through them.
Okay. Well, number one, we should mention that Hirohito had dressed and prepared himself to go out to the USS Missouri, but did not go. He sent 2 statesmen in his place. The Americans, who could have used a bosun's chair, now anyone who's not a
Naval person.
naval person won't know about a bosun's chair, but a bosun's chair is like a giant swing that they lower over the side and you get strapped into it and you are winched safely up. No, they made the Japanese boarding party climb a rope and wooden ladder up the side of the Missouri, which is no short distance, in really dangerous seas. It was very rough indeed. And these poor chaps in their morning suits and top hats climbed up the ladder.
Right. Message received.
Message received.
Okay.
Okay, so we also have on the Missouri, now if they were receiving the top party, they had initially believed they were receiving the emperor. If you were the person expecting this party to come and sign the Articles of Surrender, how might you ask your sailors to be turned out?
Oh, and their finest, their dress uniform.
Dress whites,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
No, MacArthur sent out the edict that there would be no dress whites. We fought them in our car keys. We'll take their surrender in our car keys.
Another message received.
Another message received.
We've had to go through mud and blood for you guys, so
That's right.
here's what we were wearing when we did it.
Yes.
Okay.
There is also the
I kind of admire that about MacArthur, to be honest. I think fair enough.
Yeah, MacArthur is the same guy, though, who stood between war crimes indictment and Emperor Hirohito because he knew the political long game.
Okay.
We already had the nationalist Chinese starting to fight the communist Chinese, and he didn't want another unstable nation. So it was in his interest to have Hirohito stay there because even though he had...
Gave stability of some diplomatic stability.
Indeed.
Okay.
Indeed.
All right, that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. Good. So it served as Admiral Halsey's flagship. It was an Iowa class. You may recall, if we could turn back time, we followed.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Okay, the signing wasn't formal. We've done that. There was a massive flyover, like a massive flyover. The sky was dark with American planes flying over. But one of the things that really tickled me was Admiral Spruance. Now, Admiral Spruance was... He had been very active at Midway and the battles in the Philippine Sea, and he was the commander of one of the massive aircraft carriers. Now, you can't have an aircraft carrier stopped because planes can't land on a stopped aircraft carrier. It must be moving for them to calculate angle of descent and angle of takeoff. So he'd been sent out in case there was a problem. And by a problem, there had already been a suicide bomber attack on Admiral Halsey's ship in the week prior to the signing of the agreement to the Potsdam Conference requirements.
So here they are signing the Articles of Surrender.
Yes.
On the USS Missouri.
Yes.
But they tell Spruance, no, mate, you hang off there because in case there's an attack on us here, you can
You're
get
going
stuck
to be
in.
the commander of the rest of the fleet.
You'll be commander of the Pacific Fleet, and you'll go the Japanese.
And you'll go.
Okay, so that's clever management. You have a risk management strategy.
You have a risk management.
You have a plan B and a plan C.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Because everybody else, like Nimitz and Halsey, the big dogs, they were on board.
Okay.
Okay.
You don't want to wipe out your entire command structure just by signing a bit of paper.
Exactly.
You want to have a just in case.
Okay.
Trust but verify, I think, was Reagan's line, almost along those times.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
One of the things that really tickles me, and I'd love to make a movie about this, there was a young man. You're needing to do something. You're looking.
I want to take a call from Melissa.
Good.
Can you? But before you tell me that the movie you want to make, Peter from Benarkan, there's a very local connection to this day here in Brisbane. Tell us the story, Peter.
Well, in actual fact, Steve, there are two local connections, but one of national importance because the 50th anniversary to VP Day is sitting in the Brisbane Botanical Gardens, and there are 15,600 plaques adorning that particular wall. It was designed by Robin Gibson.
Yes.
And it was the brainchild in 95, unveiled in 96, of the Honourable Con Shaka. And it's an amazing historical tribute to VP Day. In actual fact, my understanding, but maybe I'm wrong, was that the day was commonly referred to between VJ Day and VP Day until 1995, when Paul Keating really drove home that no, we shouldn't be using VJ Day. The proper moniker for Australia is VP Day. And the other little historical fact is that the very last treaty between the Allies and Japan was signed on the back of the Diamantina, which is not too far away from you.
Indeed. Sitting down and, yes.
What sort of vessel is the Diamantina?
The Diamantina
in the Maritime Museum up the road.
It's a very, very old vessel.
River-class frigate is what it is.
River-class frigate. What does that say, Peter? Is it a couple of guns and a rescue vessel on it?
Well, it was primarily they were designed for duty in the Atlantic, but they were quite easy to put together. There were several of them built in the Evans Deacon dock. That particular one was built up at Maryborough.
Yes.
Peter, thank you so much for your call. Can I take another call, Sue Belinda?
Oh, please do.
This one, I'm very keen to speak. Martin of Samford, you have a connection to this historical date. What is it, Martin?
Indeed, Steve. Yeah, back in 1981, I was living in Solomon Islands, and I took part in the last official Japanese government visit to Solomon Islands looking for lost soldiers from World War II.
What was that like?
Well, it was quite extraordinary. I was actually a geezer at the time in the Western Province. I was working with the Solomon Islands Broadcasting Corporation, and I met some Japanese guys in the street there, which is, it's a very remote part of the country. And I said, what are you blokes doing here? They were from NHK. We're with the expedition across on Vella La Bella. So I got on a boat and 4 hours later got across to Vella La Bella, and I landed at the village of Maravari, and then began, after a day, walking uphill through this 3 hours through the bush and streams and God knows what. And at the top of the hill, I came across this open area of ground, and there were 14 elderly Japanese war veterans, all had fought on Vella La Bella, and several students and also officials of the government of Japan. And they'd set up these camps, they'd slash the bush and set up tents and so forth. And they had these loudspeakers. And I know this sounds surreal, but it's true. They had loudspeakers and they were broadcasting into the bush. They were using old music from World War II, and they had messages from the previous commander of this particular unit calling on the men to come out of the bush and
give up their
surrender.
arms.
Did anyone come out, Martin?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. No, they didn't, but it was very interesting. I met I met all of the 14 guys who were there. One of them spoke English. And I said, well, they'd been doing this for a number of years. This was the final expedition after, I think they'd been doing it for about 10 years before that, because the last guy to come out of the bush on Guadalcanal was in 1948. So here we're talking about 1981. And I said to this chap, he spoke English. He said to me, "You American?" I said, "No, Australian." He said, Oh, oh, very much like Australia. And I said, why is that? He said, well, they were very benevolent. He said, after we fought on Villa La Vella, we went to fight on Bougainville. And he said, I was in the Imperial Japanese 17th Army, and we fought against your men on Bougainville, and I was badly injured. And your army took me to Australia for to be looked after in the
I'm kind of glad about that.
In Melbourne. I was amazed, actually. I didn't realize we'd done that. Yeah. Anyway, I said to him, well, tell me, look, we're sitting here in the jungle on the hilltop in Villa La Vella in 1981. What would you actually think if you saw a wartime soldier from 1943 appearing from the bush? And he looked at me and said, I will be astonished. And I think that's exactly how I felt. I would have been astonished. But they were very serious about this, because the men they had left behind, it was part of a major evacuation. The Japanese left Villa La Vella in the face of, serious fighting from the Americans, the Allies, New Zealand forces, etc. And they had left many men on the beach. And he told me that as they left in the middle of the night, they couldn't go back to save any of the men left behind.
Oh, dear.
And they saw them on the beach, and these men then bowed to them, waved, and walked into the bush in 1943.
Good heavens.
And many people on Villa La Vella, local village people, had said they had seen soldiers, and I think until probably around about the 50s, it was true that many probably were still alive. But by 1981, of course, they'd all gone, although many of the locals kept on saying, people were stealing from their gardens or killed their pigs and all this kind of thing.
Martin,
but to see this...
Sorry, go on.
Finally, to see the group sitting up there in the jungle, and they had this huge Japanese rising sun wartime flag, the wartime flag.
Of course.
Plus, and a huge carp flag, which is the symbol of boys in Japan.
Yeah.
And they were sitting there with these huge loudspeakers, broadcasting stream of Japanese wartime music, popular singers from that era, or even military band music. And it was echoing across the jungle, and they were calling out, "Don't worry, come out, the war is over."
Isn't that remarkable?
It was remarkable.
Martin, I really appreciate you phoning and telling the story. Do you mind if we keep your number on file? These sort of little footnotes of history, I think, are important and what the ABC should do. So if you don't mind, we'll keep your mobile phone number on file, Martin. Thank you very much for phoning.
Happy to do so. A pleasure.
Thank you. That's Martin from Sanford. We've got a couple more calls, Superlinda, which we'll actually take them in just a moment. But
Your street,
your suburb.
ABC Radio Brisbane.
You're with Steve Austin.
Let's take a couple more calls. If you've just turned on the radio, you're hearing the voice in just a moment of Superlinda Meehan, who's here for what I'm curious about. The reason is that yesterday marks the 79th anniversary of the absolute end of war in the Pacific, VP Day, as Australians call it. Councillor Paul Bishop from Redland City Council has phoned in. Councillor, you have a story about VP Day?
Yes, Steve. I think it's a very important day, and certainly locally. There were two students from Birkdale State School that were inside the perimeter, which was off limits to all civilians, and it was the area in Capalaba known as Cotton's Farm, and it was set up during the Second World War as the receiving station for all incoming telecommunications that went straight to Macarthur in the Macarthur Chambers. So it received all incoming messages during the war in the Pacific. And on this particular day, Dante Bellarino, who was Italian, and many of the soldiers were Italian, and his parents did great cooking. So they would go over for meals. So he would get candy and comics and access to Coca-Cola and all sorts of things. So he was allowed inside this perimeter because he was best friends with Huey Cotton. And the two boys were there this day. Huey had a pony and Dante had a bicycle, and they heard this commotion from down near this brick radio station, and they went over to hear what was it all about. And when they went inside, before they got there, one of the soldiers jumped onto the horse and rode it inside the station with Huey at the front, and he was rearing it up. and they were all yahooing because the news had just come through that the war was over. And so the boys then ran up or rode their bike and pony up to Mr. Cotton. He cranked up his old English Standard motor car, went down to Wellington Point pub. And the reason they went there rather than Capalaba Hotel, which was closer and was commandeered by the Americans, was that the Wellington Point pub served Forex and the Capalaba pub served Foster's. And so there's this amazing local story of the time when America came and transformed our industry, our technology, and that place is now owned by Redland City Council, is state heritage listed, and remains relatively authentic to the time when it was set up by Postmaster General and the American US military. A very important local part of our connection to that critically essential day in our history. And I think it's also interesting that it was the Americans were in control as the commanding forces of all of Australian military. So it sort of sits in this unusual place in our history. So it's really, really special.
Appreciate your call, Councillor Paul Bishop. Thank you very much. Sue Belinda, anything you wanted to add to that?
I just want to add, Councillor Bishop mentioned the MacArthur Chambers. What some people might not know is that Newstead House was also the personal planning area for General Douglas MacArthur. And when you enter Newstead House, the rooms to the right, you can see on the bottom of the door that the doors have been extended because Douglas MacArthur made the rooms fireproof by pouring concrete on the 1840s timbers.
Right.
And we chipped that off by hand.
Wow.
When the rooms were restored.
Right, okay.
And quite extraordinary.
I'm very keen to take my next call. Judith of McDowell, you have a very personal connection to this particular date, the absolute end to victory in the Pacific. What is it, Judith?
Hello, Steve and Linda. Yes, I do. My father was in RAAF Transport Squadron in 1941. He was seconded to the United States 5th Air Force 22nd Bomb Group, 33rd Squadron from May to November 42, and then back to transport with the RAAF. He was stationed, the last place was up at Morotai Island, well north of Australia, and when the papers were ready to take to Tokyo, my father was the pilot that flew the plane that took some of the big brass, not MacArthur, and those papers into Tokyo. He was invited to go on board and he declined. And I wish I'd have known more about this story later in his life to find out why he declined. When I did briefly ask, he said, I'd just flown that long flight. But we know it's correct because we have a telegram in my possession that was sent from some of his other pilots, and congratulations, Dave. And yes, I was holidaying in America once, and late at night in my hotel room, on came the black and white story of that surrender. I'd heard the speeches on radio, but I'd never seen the footage. And I watched the Japanese come aboard, and MacArthur and the men in the khakis, and the papers signed, but my dad wasn't on board.
So your dad was the pilot who took the surrender papers, the Potsdam Conference papers, into Tokyo on the flight?
Yes.
Wow. And you've got the
put
telegram.
Some of his crew, and they probably added some of the American crew, but he was the senior pilot, and he didn't come home till 1946 because the Transport Squadron did a lot of work after 1945 in bringing prisoners out of different places and returning them to Australia, where they went back to Britain and Canada, etc. But
Super, Linda.
a lot of history there,
Judith,
and we've written a family book and we've put that into it.
Judith, that is just wonderful. I know that it must be a very precious thing to your family, but I would hope at some stage you might donate it to the Australian War Memorial, because they will preserve the paper. Every day that precious telegram lives with you, it's not in the best conditions in which it should be stored. They will have the facilities to make sure that it lasts on and on and on.
Well, a lot of his photos he did send to the Australian War Memorial.
Wonderful.
But in Queensland, we have the wonderful Heritage Museum at RAAF Amberley.
We do.
And we still have one of Dad's uniforms, etc., and that's all going there.
Oh,
I
lovely.
was going to put the telegram with that lot, but I'll rethink that.
Well,
Good on you.
yeah, it just it has wider, following it at the Australian War Memorial.
Good on you, Jude. I have to move on, Jude. Thank you so much, but we might keep your number if that's all right.
Street.
Your suburb.
ABC Radio Brisbane.
You're with Steve Austin.
What I'm curious about with Super Linda, I have to wrap it up, but there are a couple of things that the Australians were really notable for, which we haven't had a chance to go to. And I'm thinking, I want to just mention, just in dot point 3, Howard Florey, I think, is a really significant one, but 3, because I think listeners need to hear this more.
Well, Florey purified penicillin, so it was used in mass inoculations for support troops. So that was incredible. A group of Australian soldiers who'd become isolated from the rest of them after Japan raided Timor, they built a radio from spare parts from cars, fridges, ovens, just the most incredibly brilliant guys.
And nicknamed the radio?
Winnie the War Winner, which is just wonderful. Winnie, of course, after Sir Winston Churchill.
Yep.
Evelyn Owen was the man who developed the submachine gun during World War One. He further refined that to become the Owen gun that was the staple of World War Two, and it saw service right through Vietnam. It could fire even in wet and muddy conditions. Incredible.
One final one?
Deceptive warfare. Australians were the people who started off deceptive warfare, ghost armies. So they built planes, they built ships, they built tent villages that made it look like huge numbers of soldiers were there, ready. But
they were just models.
They were models. But it was a good scare.
Super, and thank you so much. Really fascinating.
My absolute pleasure.
And thank you to the listeners who phoned in with some of those incredible tales.